Okay, well, it's great to be with you, and obviously this is a huge subject to deal with in a very short amount of time. So what I'm going to try to do for you is sketch out, if you like, a big picture of why, as a Christian, and especially as a Christian who has a deep love for philosophy, I don't really see that there is an argument to be made from suffering against God's existence. Now, I'm also very much aware of the fact that for many people this question is not a theoretical one. I know at the age of 14, while I was still living in Saudi Arabia, I contracted a very strange form of blood disorder, which the doctors struggled to diagnose. I found myself in one of Britain's leading research hospitals. I was in there for 8 weeks. I was in a ward where one person died every day. There were 14 beds in that ward, so it was like a critical support unit. And that really, when you encounter death on such a regular basis like that, it does begin to make you ask questions and sometimes push things deeper. I was having four injections every 6 hours of just a general, quite powerful concoction of drugs because they weren't sure what was wrong with me, and I was developing paralysis throughout my body, and they were just basically bombarding me with drugs to see if they could find something that would help me fight off whatever it was that seemed to be fighting me. And then I can remember when I finally got to the stage where all the veins collapsed in my body because of the impact of the drugs on me, and they couldn't get the needles in anymore. The things began to reach a really critical stage. And I'm fairly certain that at that point someone came to my bed and said, "Michael, I'd like to give you sort of like a big picture, sort of outline of why Christians believe that even though there is this loving God out there who cares for us, we see these kinds of things happen." I'm not sure either mentally or even physically I would have been ready to hear such a thing. So I don't want to be insensitive to the struggle you may find yourself in personally, and if there is time I'll try to say a few words about it right at the very, very end. But the problem of suffering, and if there is a loving God, why is there suffering, is I guess a peculiarly Christian one, because the Christian gospel very much is that a loving God created a loving world. He put people in it who have capacity to enjoy loving relationship with each other and also with Him, and that somehow things have gone wrong from there. So without, as I say, so in terms of just giving a brief picture, I'd just like to start off, I think, by just talking a little bit about love and the nature of love, because very often when we raise this question we jump straight into the suffering thing, but that rather fails the first condition, which actually only makes a problem in the first place. The problem of suffering isn't a problem if we don't live in a loving world. If we live in an evil world, the problem goes away. Well, it's just an evil world. That's simple. That's the answer. So if you wanted to create a loving world, and if you were God, and if you think you are God, then we will be able to arrange professional psychiatric help for you afterwards. But if there were a God and He wanted to create such a world, what would it mean? What would it take for a loving God to create a world in which love is capable of meaningful expression and experience? Now, that's a very interesting question. Let's supposing that I were to ask the girl who's just introducing me to come and stand next to me, and I were to say to her, I do a lot of travel, I'm away from my family yet again, and my 3 kids whom I love very much, and I'm missing them, and I'm feeling a bit depressed and lonely, to be honest, and I really want to feel here that someone loves me. And I produce a gun from my head, and I pull back the firing pin, I hold it to her head, and I look at her and I say, "Do you love me?" Now, what is she likely to say? Okay, well, probably yes. Okay, maybe even with tears in her eyes, she will tell me how much she loves and maybe even adores me. Now imagine you were to leave from here to go and have your sandwiches at 1:45 in a separate room, which is going to be over there. And a friend of yours sees you and says, "What were you doing over lunch?" And you say, "Well, I was just listening to this talk of God of love, world of suffering." And they say, "What was it like?" And you say, "Not very interesting, but something very unusual happened. As the speaker was speaking, this woman stood up and broke down into tears and told everyone how much she loved him." Now, would it or would it not make a difference if they knew a loaded gun was held to her head at the time? And the answer is, hopefully, it makes a difference. If you want to create a world in which love is capable of meaningful expression and experience, you're going to have to find a world and create a world in which love is capable of being meaningfully given. And we understand that uniformly as something which is given. Okay, it can't be demanded, it can't be required, it can't be forced in any way. If you were to graduate from this university with one friend who is very, very, very close to you, your most meaningful friendship and relationship you have, and you were to discover just after your graduation that the only reason they were nice to you, the only reason that they were there for you, the only reason they talked to you is your parents were worried about you and had been paying this person to be your friend for 3 years. does that change how you feel about the relationship? And the answer is, well, of course it does. Because friendship, love, for these words to be meaningful, we're assuming a set of conditions in which they are exercised, and they are neither demanded nor are they required. In that sense, they're not forced in any way. Which means that if a loving God wants to create a world in which love is capable of meaningful expression and experience, he's going to have to create a world in which he puts creatures who have will, who have the capacity to say yes, who have the capacity to say no, who have the capacity to be good, who have the capacity to do that which is wrong. And that is the world we read God created. Now, it is also wrong, however, to think that therefore that God could create just any world in which people could do anything and still have these conditions fulfilled. To me, that just simply doesn't make sense. Because the kind of freedom that we're talking about here, that makes love possible, is not a freedom that allows you to do whatever you want, whenever you want to. That is not freedom, that is anarchy. And in a system which is ruled by anarchy, you don't experience an increase of freedom within it, you experience a loss of it. And so the biblical understanding is a loving God created a loving world. He put us in it. He gave us the capacity to experience and express love with each other and with him. And he put a moral framework into this world that actually makes love possible. Love is a moral concept. It doesn't exist out of a moral framework. Not in any real sense. I can remember having a young youth group once, and my wife and I, we really didn't want to do this. We were part of a church, we were living up in the north of England, and they said, we want you to run this youth group. And my first response was no, because there were 13 girls in it, aged between 13 and 17. And I was thinking, at the age of 22, sort of teaching moral philosophy at university, just starting my doctoral research, this is not what I really feel like I'm called to do. But no one else wanted to do it, so I foolhardily agreed. Now, there was a bit of a cultural gap between me and these 13, 14, 15 and 16-year-olds. So I asked them to bring in all of their magazines for me to read, which was quite an experience, I can tell you. And having read all of their magazines, at the first night, where we had a meeting, I got them to sit down and I gave all of them a blank sheet of paper and a pen. And I just said, I'd like you to write down on this piece of paper what you'd most like to talk about in this room. And all of them, okay, without any consultation, I just said, look, whatever is the most popular thing you want to talk about, we'll talk about next week. And the second most popular, so they all went off on their own, no warning, no consultation, and there was only one subject matter that came up on every single sheet of paper. Only one. Love. What is love? Why get married? You fall in love, you get married. You fall out of love, you get divorced. Better not to get married in the first place. What is this thing called love? Now, I can remember preparing for that meeting almost like none I've ever done. We got back the next week. I asked them to sit down, and I asked them all to close their eyes. And we did a little experiment with them. I just said, I'd like you to close your eyes and imagine that tomorrow you go to school and the boy you like most comes up to you and says, I love you. How do you feel? Okay, I mean, you haven't never seen such angelic looking and happy faces in all of your life. I said, now I want you to imagine that the next day you go back to school, you hear the same boy telling a different girl, I love you. Now how do you feel? Every smile disappeared. So I got them to open their eyes and I said, you see, the words I love you are meaningful because they're given exclusively and committedly to you. And outside of that moral framework of exclusivity and commitment, those words mean nothing. That's why that group of famous British philosophers, the Spice Girls, in one of their songs had a chorus that said, don't tell me you love me, just tell me you'll be there. Don't tell me you love me. Those are just the words people say to me to sleep with us. Will you be there? It's looking for commitment. Freedom, love, these things are moral concepts. They only exist within a moral framework. If you remove the moral framework, you don't have an increase of the amount of freedom, you have a loss of it, you have anarchy. And so the biblical picture, if you read, if we give an overview here from the first book of the Bible called Genesis to the very last, Revelation, I'm going to quote from almost all of them, is that this loving God created a loving world. He put human beings in it who were capable of experiencing and expressing love. He gave it a moral framework that makes that love meaningful and real and possible. Now, here's where things start to go wrong. Because having created such beings and given us these kinds of capacities, we decided that we would break God's moral law. Now, in one sense, it's impossible to break God's moral law. Trying to break God's moral law is a bit like trying to break the law of gravity. So if you want to break the law of gravity and you climb to the top of this building, and you throw yourself from the top of this building to break the law of gravity, what will happen? What will you break? Okay, you will break yourself while proving his law in the process. In that sense, it is impossible to break this moral law that God has given us. Whenever we do, we simply break ourselves while proving his law in the process. And when we have decided to turn our back on him, to break this law, what we discover is not simply that we break this law, but we actually break ourselves. And we live in a very, very broken world, and the evidence of it is filled in this room. If we're prepared to be honest, we realise that when anyone ever lies to us, cheats from us, whenever we're stabbed in the back or betrayed by a friend, we experience that brokenness all over again. Whenever those moral laws are violated, we feel that brokenness in our lives, and it can happen again and again and again. And for some people it becomes desperate, and they simply conclude that maybe all life has collapsed of meaning, and we protect ourselves from that disappointment by trying not to be hurt in the first place. So this loving God creates a loving world. He makes it possible for us to experience express love. He gives it a moral framework to make that relationship possible, relationality possible with ourselves, with other people, with him. But when we have broken that law, we simply break ourselves and we live in a broken world. And this is the world that we are told that we now live in. In other words, the way the world is now, it's not the way it always was. God did create this world, but he created it with this capacity, and it has gone wrong. Now the question then comes where people then say, well, where is all of this evil? Where is all of this darkness that we see in the human heart? Where did that come from? Did God create that as well? And the answer is no. I have a daughter. I have a daughter. Actually, I have two daughters, but I also have a couple of nieces. And one of my nieces, one day, after her parents had finished reading to her at night, and she said, "Okay, Daddy, I finished reading now. You can turn the dark on." Now, I love that phrase. Okay, especially if you've read Dr. Seuss or you're a fan of Dr. Seuss. And if you don't know who Dr. Seuss is, then you really do need to get out there and have a life. Because that's the kind of thing he invents. Is you have a light and you also have a dark. But you don't turn on the dark. To create darkness, all you need to do is simply shut out the light. To create the moral darkness we see in this world, you don't introduce something new into existence. You just shut all the goodness and light out. And the result is that we're still here. But we just find ourselves in the dark. And we see all kinds of evil, not just simply out there, but also in here. And we realise we're capable, all of us actually, of the most terrible things. And if you've ever felt angry with someone to the point of losing control, you're suddenly aware of what it would mean to have a huge amount of power and be able to do whatever you want and get away with it, and realise why people can do, even good people can seemingly do the most terrible and awful things. So, this is the world that God creates. Now, there are two other questions that then immediately come up, and I'm sure you've already thought of them. Well, number one. Well, why did he bother to create in the first place then? Because if God was God, surely he would have some sense that things would go on like this. Does he need us in some way? Is that why he created us? You've got God, he's all alone from the beginning of the universe, he gets a bit boring. So he thinks, I know what I'll do, I'll create some potential company. Okay, he creates you and me, because he needs us. Now, that is a narrative you'll actually find in almost all world religions, and indeed in non-religious systems. In all religious and most other non-religious systems, where we talk about love, we would actually say love is something that comes after life. First of all, you have life, and then you need love. Love either then is possible because you've now got human beings who can fall in love with each other, or you need the feeling of love to procreate in order to send your genes further out into the future. Now, this is absolutely correct because in many ways love is an equality that only exists between personal beings. The reason why you and I can experience love with each other, or even loving friendship, is that I'm a personal being, you're a personal being. It's a quality that exists between personal beings. You need at least two of them. Right? Now, I know some people, especially guys it seems now, look into the mirror, sigh, and say, I'm in love, okay, while putting some gel in their hair. Okay, but that's actually quite sad, right? Because you need two different personal beings in order for love to exist as a quality. So it is correct that in other systems it may well be that God needs to create life in order to express love. But within the Christian faith, God is Trinitarian. One God, three persons. So he's one Godhead, one thing, but he exists in a set of relationships. In other words, within the Christian faith, it's not the fact that this loving God creates life in order to experience love, but rather that God is love, that is who he is. He exists in a set of living, loving relationships, and out of that, he creates life. So he doesn't create out of any sense of personal need. Now the next question would immediately be, but yes, if God is God, he would surely know everything has gone wrong, and would go wrong. And I'd agree with that. when things went wrong, God didn't go, I didn't see that one coming. Let's think about plan B. Okay, what do we do now? So the question then comes, well, if God is God and he creates this world that's capable of this, but he also knows it's going to go wrong, and then it does go wrong, and when it goes wrong it has such huge consequences, wouldn't it be better for him not to create in the first place? Wouldn't that be the more responsible thing to do? Well, this is quite a complex problem. I'm going to leave the philosophical side of it to one side just for a moment. Let me just deal with one aspect of it. You could say that. You could say, why doesn't God? Would it be better for him not to create? I have 3 children. They're currently 13, 11, and 9. My 13-year-old girl is 5'11" and now has an inside leg measurement that's taller than mine. So she causes me at the moment a lot of loss of sleep. Now let's suppose that all 3 of my children grew up to hate me. Okay? They all grew up to despise me, reject me, they never want to talk to me, they cause me unending heartache and pain for the rest of my life. I die at a ripe old age of, let's say 87, because I'm incredibly fit, so I'm likely to live for a long time. And we are never reconciled with each other. And let's suppose I know that is going to be the case before I have them. Now, what would I do? Well, actually, I have options. Because if I wait for a month and sleep with my wife the following month, I actually get different kids each time. Now, you might be a bit confused about this. You may not know how it works. If you don't know how the system works, talk to one of the people in the great teachers who says food for thought. They will explain to you how the system works. But I would be able to elect not to have that one. I could have a different one. It's just very simple. There's a very simple biological process involved that would allow me to do that. And to be honest, that's what I would probably do. Because I would simply not want that. I wouldn't want to bring into existence someone I know who would reject me. But does it make God more loving or less loving that he is willing and happy to give existence to people who he knows will reject him? Which one is it, do you think? It's an interesting question, isn't it? This loving God creates a loving world. He creates it for us to have a relationship with him. But when we have turned our back on him, and when we break this law, we find we have broken lives, we live in a broken world, and this has broken God's heart. It's not the fact that he doesn't care, we read he is heartbroken. He longs to bring this world back to himself. When Jesus Christ came into this world, he wept over Jerusalem and said, I have longed to bring you back to myself, but you were not willing. I have longed to gather you like a mother hen gathers her chicks, but you wouldn't come to me. So the idea that God is somehow dispassionately interested in this from a distance and doesn't care is also wrong, because that's not in the biblical picture either. God does care. But not only do we read this has broken his heart, we also read he's actually been determined to do something about it. Just before Jesus Christ went to the cross, we read that Jesus Christ took a loaf of bread and held it in front of his disciples and said to them, this is my body broken for you. And this is my blood, when he picked up a cup of wine, shed for you. So having broken God's law and having broken lives, living in a broken world, and this has broken God's heart, he came into this world and was broken for us. Christian gospel, the reason why we call it good news, is that this loving God who created a world and gave it the conditions to experience and express love, knew it would go wrong, but he still loved it. That while we were still his enemies, when we still had no interest in him, he was still loved us. He still stepped into this world, and when we were still far off, he took on the consequences into himself of all of that which we had done wrong. And he was broken for us on the cross. This is how we know that God loved us, not that we loved him, but that he loved us and gave himself for us to death, even death on the cross. Now, the good news of this is that Jesus Christ doesn't simply die on the cross, but he conquers over death, the consequences of our turning the back on God, and he is raised to life. And he comes and he offers us new life, each one of us, now. In other words, the broken world in which we live in, and the brokenness which we have experienced and do experience, is mended. The brokenness that we've experienced in our life through the hurt and rejection of others can be dealt with. The brokenness we've experienced in our life because of the damage that sin has done to ourselves can be dealt with. And the brokenness that we experience in our relationship with God, where we feel separated and alienated from Him, is dealt with on the cross. He pays the price. He takes what has gone wrong for what we have done to make it possible for us to be with Him. Because forgiveness always comes at a price. Look, if I lent you my car and said, here, have my car, you can have it. Take it for a spin. Here, it's a lovely car. It's a Volkswagen, which obviously everybody aspires to. It's one of the real aspirational makes. And you go out there and you crash it. And you come back to me and you say, Michael, I've crashed your car. It's true, I can say to you, look, and I can say to you, look, I forgive you. You were driving too fast, and it really wasn't a good idea to drink that bottle of vodka just before you went out. But I forgive you. That's true. But that doesn't mean, therefore, that no one pays for the crashed car. It just means I pay. You don't pay, I pay. Someone pays. And God is willing to pay for what we have done wrong. Now, this then raises one last question, which I'll do now, and then we're going to have to end, because we have to end at 1:45 today, so this is a very short talk, one of the shortest we're giving here this week. You might further go on to say something like this. Okay, Michael, let's assuming this narrative is correct. Okay? Let's assume there was this loving God who did create this world. And in order for it to be a loving world, He gave it the conditions, He gave it what it needed to experience love and to express love. And let's assuming it's true that we've all messed up, okay, and the world we live in is broken, we are broken, our society is broken, everything is broken, but God was willing to be broken for us, but somehow through that cross and through His resurrection, He triumphed over all of this, and He healed us, and now He gives us new life, and He promises a new world which is eventually to come. You might then say, but don't you still have doubts in your heart? I mean, when you see something like the tsunami, okay, the Asian tsunami, when you see something on that scale, as a Christian, doesn't it make you just doubt Him and think, well, maybe this is all wrong? And I think that's a very fair question. The Oxford Union asked me to come and give a talk to them just after the tsunami at Oxford University, and the title they originally were suggesting was God and the Tsunami, and the only reason I felt nervous about it was that given the fact that hundreds of thousands of people have died, I just said, look, we seem to be organising an event and pulling a crowd on the back of the death of hundreds of thousands of people, and I feel nervous about that. Can we go with the title God of Love, World of Suffering? And I promise you that within the context of my talk, I'll talk about the tsunami. And so they agreed, and so this is what we did. And as we're going through that talk, I came towards the end of it, and actually I quoted to them from Luke, and this is actually Luke's Gospel here, Luke 21. And I quoted from the 21st chapter of this book in here. And I said, you may ask me this question. And I said, and my response would be this. Look, it would be true that if I saw things happening in this world that Jesus Christ said wouldn't happen, I would doubt Him. Does that make sense? If Jesus Christ said, hey, this would never happen and things won't be like this, and then it happens, you would think, oh, how could you possibly be God? But if I see things happen in this world that Jesus Christ not only said would happen, but promised they would happen, it doesn't cause me to doubt Him, but it does cause me to question, what does this mean? In Luke 21, Jesus Christ said there would come a time when the nations would be appalled at the roaring and tossing of the seas. Now, normally captains of boats are appalled at the roaring and tossing of the seas, not nations in the plural. I said, so when I see these kinds of things happen, it doesn't cause me to doubt Him, but it does cause me to question, what on earth does all of this mean? As a Christian, I don't sit here thinking that there's nothing wrong with this world, or that there's no evil in this world. Of course I do. I see it all around me. I read the evidence of it every time I pick up the newspaper. But I believe there is an explanation as to why we live in the world that we do. And I also see something in the nature and the character of God Himself, who's not only willing to create such a world and endow the world with these kinds of possibilities, but who He Himself is willing to pay the price for things which we have done wrong in order to bring it back to Himself. And it's because of partly because of things like that I actually myself ended up becoming a Christian. Not simply because it made sense of the world which I see, but also for the hope that it actually brings, and the fact that this is centred in a historical reality of a resurrection event, which is not a theological event in the sense of, here's an idea that might help with this. But if it is true that it's possible to be raised to death, and there is not just simply this life, but there is an eternal life to come, and we can look forward to a new heaven and a new earth. It helps me put everything that's happening here now into perspective.